Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen.
Christos voskres.
Voisin voskres.
Well, welcome everybody to Beards, Brew, and Babble, episode 3. My name is Father Cornell and I'm the associate pastor of this lovely cathedral community and parish in which we find ourselves today. It's a little rainy and mucky and ugly outside, so Father Timothy and I are inside. As always, to my right, Father Timothy, pastor of St. Anthony of the Cave and Caves Ukrainian Orthodox Parish here in Edmonton, Alberta, is joining me today. First of all, Father Tim and I both want to thank you very much for all your feedback, all your messages of suggestion, some critique in production. Those are all very helpful, and we really appreciate each and every one of them. Especially thank you to the person who pointed out that last week one of our very important features of our moniker were missing in the props. So this week we made sure that we had the brew. And just to clarify, because a lot of you got a kick out of and wanted some clarification on exactly what kind of brew we're using during our podcast. So here it is. This is very nice Venezuelan brew. Thanks to local coffee shop and roaster Paramo here in North Edmonton. So there's nothing else but very good, delicious coffee in these cups today, folks. All right, so episode 3. As many of you, at least in this part of the globe, in this part of Canada, know, we are currently in what is referred to as stage 1 of reopening or re-entry in the province of Alberta. And somewhat to our surprise, worship communities which were anticipated to be involved in the stage 3 re-entry were suddenly mentioned in the stage 1 re-entry phase. So Father Timothy, you and I have been getting a lot of calls about, so can we come to church on Sunday? So can I come and baptize my child now? So can we reschedule that wedding we were supposed to have in May? So can I come to communion and confession? Maybe we should just take a few minutes to talk about exactly how that looks in the way of what worship communities are allowed to do and under what conditions. Do you want the cheat notes here?
No, it's
you
okay.
got it.
I think I got
it. Okay, good.
So it's not, well, it's very easy for me, being a father of 2 young daughters, to see this similarity in excitement with children, both spiritual and my biological children. When my kids are excited about something, they hear about the first 3 words that I say. And that seems to be the case that even myself, I got caught doing. When we heard places of worship are a part of phase 1, my mind started going, okay, what are the things that we can do to make sure that we can re-enter and we can do so safely? But there's a very, very big caveat that has been placed beside this re-entry or reopening of churches here in the province of Alberta. So yes, we are allowed to reopen. We are allowed to assemble in groups of up to 50. I often hear on phone calls and in texts and even speaking to some people, well, over the phone or through online meetings, okay, well, we can have 50. Not so. What the restrictions really are is 1/3 of our capacity or 1/3 of our normal attendance. There's a little bit of discrepancy there. 1/3 of our capacity, that is to ensure that we have social distancing in the church, as well as we have to make sure that we don't have any one of the high-risk groups involved as well. So that's no one over 65, no one with serious underlying health conditions is permitted to be among that group. And of course, all the questions about baptisms, about marriages, about receiving communion and confession, funerals and everything. Well, funerals there's always been a provision that where we can maintain that 6 feet of distance. There's certain elements of the funeral, like the last kiss and the veneration of the cross that accompanies that of course we haven't been able to do because of sheer practicality. But I mean, we are allowed technically to reopen. We are allowed to gather in groups of up to 50 if our space requires, or if our space gives us the ability to do so, allowing for 6 feet between family groups. Of course, it's also recommended that there are masks worn by all who are in attendance. I personally am horrified at the notion of wearing a mask while serving, which is something that I won't do. Like Father said before when we were having lunch, I'd rather live stream than liturgize wearing a mask, unless absolutely necessary.
Unless absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a big thing about singing. The province from very, very early on has said choral singing is one of the fastest ways to transmit a virus such as COVID-19.
So good on you, Dr. Hinshaw, because I think you were, if not the first in the country, one of the first to do that. So
absolutely,
we were warned very early in Alberta, at least, about the risk of singing.
Yeah. So even with singing, I mean, even with all of the, if we meet all of these conditions, it's not going to be the same as we are all hoping for it to be. Any singers would have to be behind, just like when you go into any store nowadays, behind a plexiglass shield. One singer behind the plexiglass shield. Everyone else will have to be spaced out. And of course, we can't celebrate any of the Holy Mysteries in a way that would offer them the dignity that they deserve. Can you imagine celebrating a wedding, Father, and having some sort of tray and a stick offering the common cup from 6 feet away?
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Or baptizing a baby.
We would end up looking like news reporters now when they are taking interviews on the street with these long 6-foot poles.
Absolutely.
That's just not going to work in the church
setting. No.
So I think the bottom line for us, brothers and sisters, beloved ones, for right now is we're in a holding pattern, at least for, I think it's safe to say, another couple of weeks. Continue to tune in on live stream, whatever your preferred live stream is. This week, by the way, we're going to be at St. Anthony Church at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. But at least for the next couple of weeks, we're not going to be flinging the doors of the temples open. If any of you were hoping for that, I mean, in a sense we all are, but the reality is that's just not going to happen before the end of May, and probably not for the first week or two of June, at least. Yeah. So I think we can just look at our calendars and plan for that. And then, Father, I think even when we're talking about that, the hierarchs are going to, and of course our hierarchs are very aware of provinces beginning to slowly open up and setting conditions for that re-entry. And the hierarchs will have to, at some point, as our Metropolitan did right at the outset of the COVID crisis, set another encyclical to the plenitude of our church in Canada and inform us about what conditions the church is going to place on how we are going to re-enter. So some of that, Father, may include our own efforts in deciding who can come when, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because we love you all that these efforts have to be made and these restrictions have to remain in place. It's as Bishop Ilediwan keeps reminding us when we talk to him on the phone, it's because we love our people that we have to have these restrictions in place, because we don't want you to come to church and get sick. We don't want you to come to church and have what happened with that one church in Calgary that Dr. Hinshaw mentioned, where they had 42 people and 24 of them came down with COVID and 4 were in the hospital and 2 of those 4 died.
Have died.
Yeah, so I mean...
Directly as a result of choral singing.
Exactly, directly as a result of, yeah, and that's what we don't want. The church, we as priests and the church is the bestower of life, and both spiritual life, eternal life, but also we have to be mindful of the fact that we are psychosomatic beings. We're both body and soul, and we have to take care of both our bodies and our souls.
Well, if I could just remind everyone of His All Holiness Patriarch Bartholomew's words again at the onset of all this. What's at stake is not our faith. What is at stake are human lives. And that's what we are still all invested in, while modifying our methods and instruments by which we transmit the faith and continue to sustain the church community. We are nevertheless still very invested in keeping all of you, and quite frankly, we want to keep ourselves safe so that we can continue to serve in our capacity as your priest in this community. And I'm just going to, if you'll allow me a little footnote here, because most of us will remember, especially in Edmonton, Father Andrew Yarmus, who was one of your predecessors over at St. Anthony's. He announced this morning that due to a likely exposure to COVID-19, he is now in a 40-day isolation as blessed by his hierarch. So those of us, especially in the UOCC and more specifically in Edmonton, who know Father Andrew, please keep him and his family, the Brodica Christi, and their kids in your prayers while they go through this time of quarantine, and pray that it's not more than simply an indication of exposure, and it doesn't get any more serious. So Father Andrew, we're praying with you, and we're thinking of you. You're close to our hearts. So having said some of this, Father, very apropos for this particular week, and with the change in conditions of COVID, you and I and a number of our faithful and other clergy were able to enjoy Sister Vasa Loren's latest podcast over on patreon.com. And she specifically, in light of now openings of churches and places of worship all around the world, and she happens to be in Vienna, Austria. For those of you who aren't familiar with her, she has a YouTube channel called Coffee with Sister Vasa. And she's also podcasts, I believe, once a week on a site called Patreon. It's a subscription site. And this particular topic was very appreciated. It was on the communion practices of the church in light of churches considering alternative methods of communing the faithful to the current practice, which is the use of the spoon. So, Father Timothy, at this point, I'm going to let you be Professor Timothy.
Okay.
And let's talk about Sister Vasa's offering in her podcast, and let's talk about how that can affect the UOCC.
Okay. Well, it was a very wonderful podcast. Truth be told, the night before, 2 hours before that podcast was issued, was published, I had gathered all my books to do the very same thing myself. And then I saw hers, and at least I knew I was on the right track, that I have someone else that agrees with me. So anyway, her podcast was very much in line with the way I was looking at things. Of course, we look at communion. We can go all the way back to the Didache in chapter 9, and it talks about communion, and then we see various practices, and we have some old rubrics as well. The liturgy that's often called the Liturgy of St James, which, I mean, it's attributed to him, but it's not written by him. But the rubrics for that liturgy and other ancient liturgies talk about the reception of communion via the body being separate from the blood. Okay, so everybody in the ancient church would line up. They would, some of the earlier rubrics say that they received the body in their right hand. Later on, that develops into the form that we as clergy are used to, or anyone that's seen the clergy commune, the form that we are used to receiving communion, where we put our right hand over top of our left, and the celebrant, when we receive communion that way, or even when we're liturgizing, we keep our hands that way, and the body is placed into the right hand, and we partake of it. We take it into our mouths, and then following that, we take the cup.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because I think that's an important point and a distinction to make at this point, because you and I both know there are individuals in the parish, in the church, not just in the parish, but in the church, where certain things are taken for immovable, unchangeable truths. And so this is important because you may not see, and maybe until now you didn't know how it is that clergy commune at the Holy Table, because normally at that time the beautiful doors and the katapetasma, the curtain, are closed, and so you normally don't see that happening. Why this is important is because it is to avoid, I hope, in your taking of this information and consideration of it, that what we're talking about and what Father Timothy is presenting, what Sister Vasa presented yesterday, is not something, we're not talking about something new, and we're not talking about something that's out of practice in the church. It's out of practice in one portion, and as many things liturgically happen to be, what we may not see on a regular Sunday without hierarch, we see hierarchical liturgy, and there are elements there that are actually the norm. That we don't, we take it as something special, but actually in many cases it's the last remnant of what was the ancient norm.
Well, I would even go further. We're throwing around this phrase, the new norm, or new normal. But what I would say is those things that are preserved in the liturgy are the true and perfect norm.
Right, the authentic norm.
The authentic norm.
Yeah. So this is, I just wanted to make that distinction before you go on.
Absolutely.
That there is, when things like that happen, it's a bit artificial too, because sometimes there is if we look into the liturgical history, certainly not all of them, and not even a lot of those things, but some of them have this little scent of clericalism.
Absolutely.
In separation of how clergy do things as opposed to how the laity, and in most cases, are done too. Because there was this tendency toward clericalism in different types of the church. Well, back to you, Father.
Okay. Well, we're the priests of the priests.
Yes.
Every baptized, laos to theon. The people of God.
Yeah.
And by virtue of our baptism, every single member of the church is a member of the royal priesthood in the holy nation.
Absolutely.
Well, and so as Father began, there are things that are true and essential and unchangeable, and there are things that are changeable. Okay, so the thing that is unchangeable about communion is the breaking of the bread and the partaking of the blood. This concept of breaking bread and partaking of the cup. It really kind of conjures up this image from Luke 24 of the apostles on the road to Emmaus, that their eyes were opened and that they were able to see Christ in the breaking of the bread. And so that is the thing that is unchangeable. This whole concept of a spoon, while we don't really see this come into liturgical practice, it begins in the 8th century. And then it kind of coincides with the relics of the crucifixion being brought to Constantinople. Because the spear was one of the relics of the crucifixion that was brought to Constantinople for veneration. So following that, a short time after, they started to prepare the gifts, they started to prepare the loaf. This was even before there was really even commemorations of people, of the Theotokos, of the 9 ranks of saints, of the living and of the departed. The proskomidi, as it is in the ancient rubrics, is the priest cuts out the lamb, the priest that is assigned, flips it over, cuts a cross, puts it back down, and that was it. But after the relics of the crucifixion came to Constantinople, they started shaping the knife like a spear, because the spear was there. That soon followed, and this was really what I like to call imperial expedience. There were so many thousands of people in church going to communion. Instead of having everybody line up and partake of the body and then partake of the blood, they decided to be expedient and put the body in with the blood. And there is a few patristic mentions of how, since it ties together the body and the blood into unity, and so that's why they decided to put it on a spoon. Now, the spoon, which was a very practical thing, became theologized. And even the spoon that we have at St. Anthony's and many other parishes have, it has seraphim with their wings crossed. That forms the handle. So that became theologized as the tongs that we see in Isaiah chapter 6, where the seraph took the burning coal off of the altar and touched the lips of the prophet, and that full notion is brought to completion at the end of communion, the way we have it now, where the priest, the last thing he says before he takes the chalice and puts it back on the altar is, "Lo, this has touched your lips, your sins are forgiven and your iniquities are purged." So even though it was received or it began in the 8th century, by the 9th century we see, and bear in mind, we were still in communion with what we now call Western Christians. So we have these Latin bishops criticizing the use of the spoon. Okay? We see this criticism taking place by the 9th century. It wasn't really fully embraced by the fullness of orthodoxy, the use of a spoon, until the 12th century. Okay, so that's the 12th century. We're in the 21st century.
So for the church, that's young.
That's young. And so the normative practice for the early church was the receiving of the body, followed by the receiving of the blood, in separate vessels.
So as we wrap things up for today, Father, just to plant a seed, all right, for discussion, and because ultimately the hierarchs are going to have to direct us.
Absolutely.
How we're going to do this.
Absolutely.
Well, how could we do this?
Well, how could we do this? In my opinion, okay, I'm just going to open with this. This is the way I've been explaining it all week to everyone I've talked to. You cannot put toothpaste back in the tube. So there's all of these, we're talking to our brother priests, because the United States and Europe, they're further ahead in terms of their reopening than we are. And so there are a lot of things being proposed. So Sister Vassalaren, even some of our brother clergy are talking about using things like bamboo spoons, that individual spoons be given to every communicant, and these be collected and they be burnt, they be disposed of properly. However, there's a joke that I like to tell. I'm a liturgical theologian. I say, what's the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist? You can negotiate with a terrorist. And so the way I feel about the spoon, even individualistic spoons, is it takes us further away from the initial intent of that unchangeable breaking of the body and partaking of the blood.
You're innovating on the innovation.
Innovating on the innovation. And once that toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't get it back in. So if we start with individualistic spoons, once this COVID crisis is ended, once all the restrictions are lifted, we can't go back to a singular spoon. So in my opinion, in my humble opinion, having examined this topic quite extensively, in my humble opinion, the answer to this would be, now there are some caveats currently, but it would be, at least for the time being, for us to commune the faithful by intinction. And intinction literally means dipping. I don't think we would dip individual particles, but we would sprinkle the blood on the body.
Which is, by the way, again, similar to how we prepare the reserved gifts on Holy Thursday or through various times of the year.
And liturgy for
sanctified gifts as well.
Yeah. So we would put the body onto the blood, and the celebrant would stand in the middle of the church, the discos on a small table, and every person would come up with their right hand over their left. They would have, in my opinion, a red napkin put on their hand. The body would go onto their hand. They would take it off of the red napkin. The napkins would be gathered and disposed of properly. And that is how communion would be. At some time, yes, we would have to have an eye on restoring the partaking of the blood through the chalice. But for the time being, this would actually probably even require, in our current climate, would require the use of a mask by the priest, just to be safe, and clean hands.
Right, and some consideration of social distance.
Absolutely.
In the partaking of the actual body.
Absolutely.
So that would have to all, but that is a very possible option.
Absolutely.
So there's your mic drop moment, everybody.
But I'm just getting started.
Episode 4, part 2 of Father Tim's apologetics for going back to the authentic practice of communion. Anything else you want to finish off with?
Well, truth be told, I have been a proponent of this sort of, often a game, well not a game, but a conversation that we as liturgical theologians have is, if you could change things in the church, if reform was possible, what are some of the things that you would do? And this is one of them for me.
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
And those of us who know him, we know that's one of his big ones. That's a top 3 for him. Okay, so everyone, thank you again for tuning in to see us. Yes, we better finish off with the scene with all 3 elements at the end of the podcast. So again, thank you very much for tuning in. Please subscribe, please like, please comment, and please suggest topics. I know we have one already that's come in. Thank you very much. We look forward to more of those. And, I don't know, we mentioned this in the first episode. If you're interested in joining us, we're open to a 3rd chair or even a 4th or 5th chair. As long as we can social distance the podcast, no problem. Otherwise, until episode 4, stay healthy, work on staying holy, be an active and participating home church wherever you and your families are, and we'll see you in about a week's time with episode 4. Thanks, Father.
Thank you.
Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen.
All the best, everyone.